This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is Dylan Mosley, head brewer for Civil Life Brewing in St. Louis, Missouri. Welcome to the podcast, Dylan.
Thank you very much.
A couple of years ago, or maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I ended up in the brewery here with our co-founder of Craft Beer and Brewing, John Bolton. We had stopped by. We had seen a cask ale from Civil Life on tap at another bar in town and thought, if there's a brewery making cask ale, I want to check that place out. We thought, we'll stop by for a round, and we walked in here not knowing what to expect, never having been here before, and somehow ended up spending the rest of the night in this place. It's such a comfortable pub environment, and the beer focus of Civil Life on small, sessionable but flavorful beers is something that just kind of captured my excitement, entertainment, and I've been a fan ever since. Got super excited when Civil Life started to can. When you guys started shipping us some beer to taste, it was a strange thrill now to be able to taste that American brown ale out in Colorado where we are. And I've got a pint of it in my hand right now that I'm going to continue to drink while we talk about brewing right here. But before we get started, we are going to talk about brewing flavorful, sessionable beers. I think that's just such a awesome focus for the brewery, and you all do it so well across some different nationalities, but with that common focus of making low ABV beers. Almost the entire tap list, I think, is below 6% or somewhere in that realm.
Yeah, we, especially when we first started, we certainly didn't have a beer that was really even approaching 6%.
Yeah.
And we've since decided that we can afford to throw a few beers into the mix that are more in the 6 to low 6s.
So a big beer for you is 6.5%.
It is. It really is.
We can talk a little bit more about that in a second. But first, as the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling, G&D Chillers has set the standard on quality, service, reliability, and dedication to their customers' craft. For 25 years, G&D has led the way with innovative solutions for the craft brewing industry. Contact G&D Chillers today at 1-800-555-0973 or reach out online at gdchillers.com. Mention Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast, and you'll receive up to $1,000 worth of glycol with the purchase of any new G&D Chiller unit. And stay connected to the heart of craft beer and the revolutionary tastemakers behind every can and bottle. Download the free Tavour app to get highly rated independent craft beer delivered right to your door. Recently featured beers include Within Us from Anchorage, Stargate Nectarine from Black Project, King Sue from Toppling Goliath, Ninja vs. Unicorn from Pipeworks, and Bière de Paix from Side Project right here in St. Louis where we are today. Get $10 in beer money today with code BREWING. So Dylan, tell me a little bit about your arc in beer. You were a home brewer. You were working in a bar.
Yeah.
Where did the love of beer come, and how did that brewing experience develop to the point where you are now running a commercial brewing operation here?
Well, it began very specifically with a grocery store in my local neighborhood when I lived out west. I had moved there for graduate school. And I'd come from, I'd come from St. Louis, and found myself in Seattle. And the local grocery store had what looks like now a regular beer aisle, but this is 15, 20 years ago.
Sure.
And I hadn't seen anything like that before.
Sure.
And I didn't.
That was like my first experience. I went to college in Memphis, and then went out to it was like probably 1996. Went out to Boulder, Colorado, and went into Liquor Mart or one of these supermarkets. Like, what? I didn't know that all this beer existed at the time.
I thought I was being pretty cutting edge drinking Guinness. And
sure.
So when I saw this beer, I just needed to know what it was, and
sure.
So started grabbing bottles, and eventually became kind of grocery store friends with the beer buyer there, and he gave me some great selections, and I just it was at that point in my life that I realized I didn't know what beer was, and that was really fascinating. So that's really what got me into homebrewing. Homebrewing definitely helped bring me to this point. But honestly, it was the grocery store.
So when did you start brewing, and did you keep brewing throughout, a career in kind of hospitality after that?
My first couple of homebrews were dramatically unsuccessful. And I really didn't have any good information. I knew that I wanted to do it. But they were really bad. They were really bad.
Sure.
And
it's a very common story.
So I kind of just, we ended up moving to, we ended up moving across the States and found ourselves in a home that didn't really have a great spot to brew. So I, once again, just wasn't brewing. And then we moved back to St. Louis, and I had this really big house with this giant basement, and suddenly I'm like, I can brew, and started doing that. And at the same time, kind of meandered my way over to a wine bar that Jake Hafner, who owns Civil Life, he was running the wine bar, and running the wine bar. And I ended up working for him, and my enthusiasm for beer rubbed off on the wine bar, and we found ourselves being kind of one of the hubs in St. Louis for people that were getting interested in beer.
So how did you guys decide to take that love and excitement for beer and then turn it into this brewery? Because that's a big step, going from running a wine bar that people are excited about beer with to saying, hey, let's start a production brewery and make a lot of this stuff, and then open our own tap room with this kind of pubby feel within this larger warehouse.
Well, Jake has a much more fun story about all that. My story is that Jake told me that's what we were doing.
Sure. Hey, but fair enough.
But he credits...
You weren't going to say no.
He credits a homebrew party that we had where, our friends were there, and the beer was coming out all right, and he, in the back of his mind, had an idea that he didn't want to be in the wine bar for the rest of his life, and it just, I don't know, it's that whole snowball thing. One thing leads to another. But when he brought it up, Mike, the other founder of Civil Life, was working there as well, and we're both looking at each other like, what is this really going to happen? And like, well, who's going to brew? And he's like, well, you guys are. Okay, well, I guess we better learn how. So I took some courses at Siebel, and did as much research as I could by just harassing other local brewers about what I needed to learn, and I'm still learning.
For sure, I think we all are. Talk to me a little bit. Jake envisions this crazy idea for this brewery, and you all get together and build a beer program for it. Mm-hmm. And somehow, in the midst of this, and what is this? 2013, 2012, somewhere in there.
Well, we're in our 8th year now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So 2011 then.
Yeah. Well, I guess. So we're in our 8th year. It took us about a year to get the building improved, and we had been kind of working toward it for about a year and a half before that.
Okay. So, the beer world is a little different, thing at that time.
Absolutely.
It certainly wasn't as taproom focused as it is right now. It wasn't necessarily as hospitality focused. Mm-hmm. It was definitely, a little more production beer focused. And the idea was, if you launched a brewery, you had to be kind of distributing beer in some sort of form or fashion.
Sure.
You come up with an idea that seems almost like, commercial suicide to make a whole bunch of small session beers, because the other trend at that time was big beers. Craft beer was differentiating itself from the mainstream by being more extreme.
Yes.
By being more bitter, by being bigger, by being more imperial, and Stone and arrogant bastard were casting themselves against this corporate beer, whatever.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I mean, here you are in the shadow of Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, and you're like, we're going to make small sessionable beers that people can drink a lot of. That seems weird to me.
Well, I will agree with you. And in point of fact, I think we saw ourselves initially maybe thinking that we would end up with a beer portfolio that looked a little bit more like Founders.
Okay.
And through home brewing and through our own, you reach in the fridge and you grab the beer that you bought, rather than the beer you thought you should get. It just ended up being that lower ABV beer that really wasn't. We weren't inventing anything, but rather maybe we were just putting something forward that had always been there, but maybe just was on the mantle with too many other things, and you take some of those other things off, and suddenly you see it again. And I really looked at Schlafly as a brewery that had done a lot of things right up until that point, and especially with their kind of outreach to the Midwest, both in terms of what they were actively doing just out on the street, and I really even appreciated just the simplicity of their bottle labels, where it's like Pils is a red label and it says Pilsner on it, and then Schlafly. And so I felt like there was an earnesty in what you were reaching for. And so when we kept brewing and brewing and brewing here at Civil Life, we kind of found out that we were making Civil Life beer. And one of the things that I think we've discovered is that people will tend to trust a Civil Life tap without necessarily knowing what it is. They're willing to give, if they see our tap out somewhere, I think they feel like they already have a head start in knowing what they want, because...
how do you earn that? How does that happen? It doesn't just happen overnight, and it doesn't happen by magic,
Seriously, yeah.
There's a lot of reinforcement that takes, and there's a lot of, building that idea of consistency, is certainly something every brewer wants to have, but it's not something that every brewer has.
Well, and you can't discount the stars being just right, but I do think, we got a lot of traction with our brown, our American brown. And I guess two things about that beer is it was one of the very first beers that we brewed here. And again, going back to home brewing, I'd only ever brewed 20 gallons of beer before, and then we started brewing here. And it was a little heart-wrenching. But that first taste of brown beer out of the tank, when it was far enough along to be considered much more finished than unfinished, I thought to myself, man, I think we're gonna make it. I like this beer.
That was your first batch.
That was
that's a good time.
Yeah. I was happy with it, and we got a lot of traction out in the market with it for a number of reasons.
It's a decidedly unsexy style. Brown ale couldn't feel more like Dad's craft beer from the 1980s, 1990s. And I think when I think brown ale, you still go back to Pete's Wicked Ale and or Pete's Wicked Brown, and some of these. It just feels. But at the same time, I'm drinking it right now and absolutely loving every sip of this thing. I'm not exactly sure why. Tell me why I love this beer so much.
I think it's because we use brown malt.
Okay. So brown malt, is it a commercially available brown malt, or
it is? With beer, you've got, just like you have 4 simple ingredients, there are a lot of different ways you can make beer appear, and there are different ways you can change the flavor of beer. And one of the things that brown malt does is it changes the appearance and the flavor.
Okay.
And I think that a lot of mistakes that have been made in and around certain styles is moving the color to where you want it, but using the wrong choices to get to that. Like you're getting that color, but how are you getting it? You can use a little bit of black malt and you can get red. You can use a lot of other types of malt and get red. Like, so it's kind of like you're at the paint store, a little dabble do you, and all of a sudden you've got a completely different blue on your hands. And so with brown malt,
thank you for I use the pigment analogy all the time, and you just brought it up without me having to raise it. I love it. Thank you. Thank you.
No problem. I'll take $1,000 with that glycol they were mentioning earlier. So
talk to me a little bit about that then. Obviously there are flavor, contributions from malt when you're building,
yes.
Kind of malt forward beer like this.
Yes.
There are dangers on both sides. There's dangers to building it with not enough character where you're just pushing color. There are dangers to, doing it with something like, too much caramel, forward malt, which just creates a kind of cloying sweetness and, a difficulty for how do you ride that line between those things? Because one of the things I really enjoy about this beer is it has that substantial malt character, and it has some of that sweetness, but it still seems to clean that sweetness up as you move through the beer and finish that sip.
Yeah. I wish I could explain it more concisely, but like finding those moments of sympathy in a beer where you've taken these different components and you've compressed them into a can or a bottle or a keg or whatever. You do have to kind of have enough experience with enough types of malt from numerous vendors to really kind of know that, like, this Maltster's brown is not this one. There's huge differences. Just because they say brown and just because they're SRM doesn't seem to be that different. They're very different. And we have the luxury of being able to purchase malt from, lots of small and medium-sized maltsters. That gives us a huge advantage in not giving the samey. When you're building beer out of a silo, it's real hard to change beers up because you've made a commitment to a price point on a grain, and buddy, you're going to taste it. So we have, at this point in time, we still, I'm looking at the malt area right now, and we've got malt from all over the world, and some of it is some of it's a little habitual. I'll give you that. There's certain maltsters I like, and certain.
Who do you
ones,
like, and why?
Well, one of the ones that I make no bones about liking at all, I love Thomas Fawcett.
Sure.
I've used a lot of their stuff. I've had virtually no problems with purchasing their malt. They've been a really critical portion of a number of the beers that we came out of the gate with, and I think that they've done a really good job. I like their malt a lot. Conversely, I've lately really been liking some malt from a newer maltster here in the States called Proximity.
Sure.
I hadn't used their malt much until like the last 6 or maybe 8 months, and we've been using more and more of it, and I've been pretty impressed with what we've used so far. It's malt is a funny thing because I do think you kind of get what you pay for. Yeah. And unfortunately, there's some built-in costs if you're buying German malt or English malt that if somehow that malt was magically produced here, it would be cheaper.
Sure.
So you're paying for a boat, I get it. But I think also too, like, there are a lot of things that build upon other things that you don't always find out about, and you don't always know where these little experiences or where these little twinkles in people's eyes came from. But and I think all things in the world are like that. And sure. So there's a reason why Thomas Fawcett makes good malt, but it's not all just science,
Sure, sure. So explain to me how you go through this discovery process, figuring out how those malts work for you in these beers when you're brewing large production batches can be an expensive learning process. And as a home brewer, you don't necessarily you're not going to be buying 55-pound bags of some of these, specialty malts in order, you can't even buy them, but even if you could, you wouldn't be able to purchase that kind of volume.
Yeah.
So talk to me about that, discovery process where you figure out and develop these ideas of malt and the flavors that are within them, that you then bring into your beer.
Well, so we don't have any kind of a pilot system. So everything gets run through 20 barrels at a time, or we just don't make it. Now, we have taken some batches and scaled them back to like a 15-barrel batch and things like that. That usually has less to do with our comfort level and going for it, and more to do with just how much beer do we need.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge believer in practicing small things. It's a vital part of becoming better at something.
Sure.
But there's also a part of me that realizes that if you want to be a home run hitter, like, you can't just go to a batting cage and practice swinging a bat, because you get into a game and things are different. And so if your practice is playing games, I bet you're going to hit the ball more, than if you just go to the batting cages. Now, you need the batting cages to, your elbow's not right, lots of reasons,
Sure,
but
sure.
I really
tweak your form and a kind of control
tweak it
environment.
a little bit,
Yeah.
So I like brewing everything kind of whole hog, but our batting cage would be more like, well, we're interested in using this malt. Let's say, so in the case of Proximity, I was interested in a couple of their base malts because I was unhappy with working with another base malt. I liked the malt itself, but working with it I didn't like. And so we started kind of sneaking in a little bit of Proximity just to see if we could ever find a difference. And we got it to a point where we couldn't find a difference. We still liked everything that we had previously liked about the beer, and the experience of working with the grain was a lot higher. Also, if it's not like a base grain and we're just trying to see how we can kind of get it into some other recipes, we'll come up with a brand new beer that we haven't brewed before, but we've used, like, say, Maris Otter. We've used a ton of it. We know what it's going to do. Now we take this new malt, we throw it in there, and we see how it works against Maris Otter. We kind of did that lately with Ordinary Bitter that we just brewed. And it's a good way to, like, take some things that have been familiar in other places and put them into a new match and kind of see how they really work that out. But again, like, I probably do have some habits when it comes to making recipes, so it's really nice to have other people work either independently or with you on recipes. So
Sure.
You don't fall into that.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. But first, with over 200 years of combined experience in the craft beverage industry, Country Malt Group's dedicated sales and support staff understand the importance of excellent ingredients, product knowledge, and expertise in making great beer. Country Malt Group's mission is to provide the products and services you need while making the process of ordering ingredients easy. The focus is to inspire your best craft. Order online at shop.countrymalt.com. Also, balancing barley and hops is your expertise, and for Clarion Lubricants, food-grade lubricants is theirs. The team at Clarion knows that when it comes to making great beer, you're the expert, and when it comes to supplying food-grade lubricants backed by service-oriented professionals, they're the experts. Clarion will work with you to create an efficient lubrication program that helps protect your brewery. To speak with an expert, dial 1-855-MY-CLARION, that's 855-692-5274, or visit clarionlubricants.com. Clarion Lubricants, the expert that experts trust. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of these kind of specifics and some of the flavor contributions that you find from some of these malts, in particular, because I always find it fascinating to to discuss with brewers how they articulate in their mind some of the contributions that some of these ingredients make.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like, talking to a chef about how, their locally sourced, ingredient that they get from this one person in this one place here makes such a difference over what, is generally available in the supermarket that other folks make. Some of those things become, again, it's, like talking to an artist about how they think about color. These are the things that feed into this, but somehow, what happens when those pieces are pushed together is greater than this individual sum, or each of the individual ingredients by themselves. So talk to me a little bit about how, when you are tasting, some of these malts, specific malts, those flavors come across, and how you find, some of those combinations working very well.
I spend a lot of time not only kind of familiarizing myself with what BJCP would like a beer to be, but I also, like porter. I also think about, okay, well, what's important to me about porter, and I always do use BJCP because I like there to be a framework that I can talk to other people, and we can be at least on the same page with some of the things we're talking about. But BJCP is not good for everything. Like when I think about porter, I just immediately think of a beer that is too difficult to discern much about it. It's just a marriage of almost too many similar things that you get lost in it. So when we've built our porter, it's the kitchen sink beer around here. It's a real chore to mill that thing in, because you'd love it. It'd be great if you could walk over there, open up 10 55-pound sacks and throw them all in, and there's your recipe. But porter's not that animal. It's like you got to open up everything, and it's
are you measuring things out and opening things? How many different malts, and how do you kind of say balance? Talk to me a little bit about how you balance like base malt with some of the various specialty malts or caramel malt contributions in there.
Well, I think I think there's, like we were talking about color. I went to school to be a painter, and one of the first things you learn about painting is that brown is a very easy color to make, because you can make it with 3 colors, and you always inadvertently make brown.
Yes, you do.
You learn that clarity is very important. So to not make brown is more challenging, and to make specific colors. When we're thinking, or when I'm thinking, I'll say that I'm thinking about making malt structure for a beer, there's always a few different ways you can get the color. There's always a few different ways you can introduce flavor. But there's only certain ways that you can get the color and the flavor to operate kind of fluidly together. And I think that I've had my share of beer where you drink it and you're like, oh, now I know what Caramel 90 tastes like, and I think sometimes the specificity of ingredients is too much. Like, oh, yep, that's Cascade. That's all this beer is, just a bunch of Cascade. If you love Cascade or you love C90, then you found your beer. But for almost everybody else, you don't want the end of the story before you started it, like you need a little something else there. So I think I probably spend a lot more time thinking about what's in the middle of the beer rather than base malt and finishing touches. So it's pretty rare that we have, I'm losing myself a little bit here. I feel like in a few of our beers that we've made recently, I've discovered that I have a much better handle on selecting fewer malts to get the same job done that maybe a couple of years ago I would have maybe thrown another couple in and kind of muddied it up a little bit. So I'm learning more and more about how to keep things kind of clean, but getting that flavor in the middle of the beer to kind of be a little bit more than just screaming at you with base malt. I don't know that I answered your question.
I'm going to keep pushing on this a little bit too. So in terms of that, what does that look like percentage wise, and
Sure.
and how are you, in a sense, kind of, in something like this porter, when we can use that for example, or the American brown, building different layers,
Yeah.
and I would love to ask you what exactly you're using. If you don't want to answer that, I understand. But what do those layers look like? You build your
Sure.
base malt layer. What's your next layer? What's your layer after that? What's your layer after that? And what's this smallest top layer that's adding that kind of that certain thing that wouldn't be there without it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, porter's a good place to go back to again. With porter, because we wanted there to be a lot going on in that beer, you certainly have to transition yourself into thinking about moving that color to a point where you do get kind of that super, super rich brown note that's really black, to the eye. But I spent me and Mike, and I guess it was me and Mike that pretty much made that beer. We spent a lot of time incorporating touches of things that we felt like you might not taste it, but that kind of needed to be there. Put a little brown malt in it, not to make a brown porter, but just to kind of get some flavor in there that we knew existed in brown malt, but it's not running up to the tip of your tongue because it's wrapped around some amber malt that is not far off in color, but dramatically different in taste. So if you can kind of find...
when you say dramatically different, what's that dramatic difference for you?
So the brown malt that we source from Thomas Fawcett has kind of a little bit of sweetness to it, but it has a nice, real kind of firm, almost kind of a bark, kind of outdoorsy kind of camp coffee kind of an attribute to it. The amber malt is actually pretty abrasive, and it's not actually a malt that I suggest to people because you have to underuse it. If you use it in even the ratios that they suggest, you're not going to like the beer. But
why not?
It's just so in your face. It's like that friend that you keep hanging out with, but like an hour into it, you're like, now I remember why I don't want to do this. So we use that malt in our amber. Again, we make brown beer with brown malt. We make amber beer with amber malt. But it's just a touch. It's just enough to get that kind of bite that wouldn't have otherwise been there. Because to get amber malt, I think a lot of times amber beer, again, it's mostly color. It's like moving just beyond orange into something real brassy, something kind of red. You can get there with caramel malt, but caramel malt's not amber to me. Amber, and I'm forming a lot of my opinions about beer through kind of antiquated notions of beer. I think some of the most interesting beer I've ever had has been either homebrew or fairly rustically made beer. And I think a lot of times commercial beer can give you what you thought you wanted, but then it's really, you're left with not a whole lot. So I've always gravitated toward things that had some slight eccentricities about them that were maybe slightly undefinable. I mean, actually, Jake just brought me a beer here in town from Urban Chestnut that was, I forget the style of beer that they were emulating, but they were using green tea, and I believe they used maybe even some sake yeast in it. And I didn't know it was from them. And I had some, and while it wasn't a beer in the sense that I would stay with that beer for long periods of time, but I thought it was really an interesting beer. And it wasn't just like one of these beers that you're interested in for the moment, and then you're like, okay, I'm ready to be interested in something else. I could be interested in that beer for a long time. It to me, it wouldn't be something that is infinitely drinkable in the sense that I just keep having that beer over and over again. But it was a really good experience. I thought that was a really unique thing.
So I'm trying to. We're still building here. You know, we've built on our base malt, and we've added some brown malt. You know, how, in that sense, are you adding some of these kind of perceptible sweetness without too much, and still maintaining, you know, that crispness, you know, of these and drinkability for some of these small beers?
I think you have to be and
building that eccentric character, you know, as well, that still helps them stand out and be their own beers.
I think now is kind of the point where you have to start being careful about things and letting recipes kind of become what they may, without trying to overthink it. There was an expression that one of our previous brewers used, and I'm having trouble coming up with it. But if he listens to this, he'll be like, "Here it is." But I think you with the brown beer, that beer wouldn't be nearly the shell of itself without Cascade. I really feel strongly that all those malts that were put into that beer were meant to come up against Cascade. If that hadn't happened, you wouldn't have that beer. And again, it's that's why it's a little hard to talk about like building recipes, because you're really not building a recipe without thinking about your water, without thinking about your yeast, without thinking about your hops. Like, these things are all part of what's going to end up being the beer. And so if you're looking for a slightly lower pH and you don't get it in your mash and you end up with something higher, it may not be the end of the world, but something will be left over from that experience. It's not entirely important that you weigh your hops, at least at our size, down to the gram, but you need to be pretty close, and as a home brewer, building these recipes is super challenging because measurement is very much against you. It's much harder to try to repeat things when you're really
the percentage difference, 1 ounce.
You're really taking a little pinch out. That's tough. Here we have some wiggle room, but with and be going back to the porter, I think that I kind of have a little bit of a rule with certain beers, and porter would be one of them, is if you're going to be complicated about it, try not to be double complicated by if it's got, some, low end crystal, it needs some high end crystal. Or if it's got, some colored malt, no, it needs some black malt, I think sometimes, if you have two crystals that are real close, but they're from different vendors, you can start to input some things into how the beer turns out that, again, you're talking about real finesse here. And maybe I'm imagining some of this stuff, but I feel
it tastes real to me. So
at the end of the day, that's all you got is right. You drink the beer and you put it on Untapped, whatever it is that people do.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, though, that you're building some malt complexity not by trying to build a broad range of all of these different malts, but by also using some different but very close kind of shades of difference there that do still, no matter how, whether they're from different vendors or whatnot, kind of add some different flavors.
Yeah, well, and this is very common knowledge, but our American brown is built from malt from across the world intentionally. We could have made a brown beer with all North American malt, but to me that's not American. like America is all over the world. That's where we came from, and or at least a lot of us. And so it was important to me philosophically for the American brown to have, not as many malts as we could from other places, not to just turn it into we got, malt from Argentina and Russia, like that starts to be a little bit too literal, and probably
slightly pedantic.
Yeah, probably wouldn't do the beer really any favors other than to give you a slightly fancier story. But what grows together goes together, and when we do styles of beer where we're going to claim an English theme or a Germanic theme or whatever, we tend to use much more percentage of malt from those countries. I don't think we have anything in our portfolio that would say English or German or whatever without more than or less than 70% from that country. And that's kind of been something I've just decided we need to do.
It's an interesting one, and I see brewers all the time naming beers that way. This is our German Pils because it's made with German hops and German malts. Mm-hmm. Or this is our Czech Pils because it's made with Czech hops and Czech, Czech malt. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the danger with American brewers is making beers that have these names on them that don't bear a resemblance to those beers in the countries that 100%, they come from.
100%.
How do you, building that to where if you're putting a country's name on it, it also in some way reflects that country's brewing tradition. And, even though those traditions are very diverse and it's not a monocultural, tradition in any kind of sense, but if it doesn't feel relatable as that kind of thing, is just naming it that way because the ingredients are from that place, is that sensible? How much are you trying to and tasting some of those inspirational beers from the countries that you're trying to, kind of bring and make your own?
Well, and I don't intend for the answer to be any kind of a cop-out, but there's going to be a little bit of that. When we do, we have a German Pils.
Sure.
We don't have a fancy machine that breaks down water. We have the city of St. Louis, running through our veins here. And we don't spend lots of...
Is the water not good? I mean, I hear they make some Pilsner here.
So the water
or a beer they call Pilsner, at least.
And they have those fancy water breakdown machines. I guarantee it. But our brewing water straight out of the tap minus some treatment for chlorine or chloramines and some membrane filtration to kind of sparkle things up a little bit more. We do that. We do some water additions for mash chemistry and things like that. But we will never have the city of, Dublin's water. We're never going to have Berlin's water. So, and that's that's almost everything that you need to put a beer onto the correct path. I think that you could do far worse than emulating the water 100% correctly and using the wrong grains. I think you would still probably end up being more close to getting something right.
The water is more important than your malt bill, huh?
I 100% believe that. Now, obviously, you're not going to want to make a brown Pilsner. And certainly, if you're trying to make a Pilsner with pale malt base rather than a Pils malt base, you're still not helping yourself. But I would still argue that, we, like I said, we don't do water breakdown or we don't build water. But to me, that's okay because it's kind of one of the only things that our city can really offer us as a brewery is the water. And it's a great thing to offer. We've got really good water. But it does mean that our, Czech style Pils isn't going to be the same Pils you have in when you're abroad. And so there's going to be some differences. Now, when you talk about other breweries doing this too, my main complaint, if I have a complaint, is that a lot of times not only will a brewery say it's Czech Pils, but then they'll still hop it like an American beer, and then it's like, okay, well, now you just wanted to be invited to the Czech Pils party. and it's okay. Like, I never want...
It sounds like a cool party for me, but...
it would be a pretty cool party. And that, that's one thing that I think American breweries have in their... it's like their ace in the hole, is that we really can do anything. We can call it whatever we want, like that's our shtick, right? You go into a grocery store now, and there's all kinds of beer with all kinds of names on it, and I don't. It's hard to know what to do with that too, but there's definitely some better and worse examples, out there in the world, and I think for us, one of the big benefits to keeping things like relatable, in the sense that this is our English pale, this is our American pale, this is our Dortmunder. It gives the customer at least a focal point. Whether or not they judge how close we got to their mind's eye, that's up to them. I'll never have that control, and I don't want it. We made the beer that I hope that we made the beer that we wanted to make. And I think largely we've been successful with that mission. We've definitely had some beer where, like, let's not brew that one for a little bit. Let's give it a rest.
Yeah.
Let's come back to that. It's a thing.
So let's talk a little bit about yeast and pivot a little bit there. So, you are brewing, with, again, this kind of mode of 6.5 and lower beers,
yep.
But that means you're embracing a range of kind of, styles that range from, traditional British style beers, German style beers, Czech style beers, etc. That's a broad range of yeast that you're potentially pulling into the brew house, and from a commercial standpoint, that can also be a kind of a costly approach to take. Talk to me a little bit about how you manage some of these and think about yeast, and and kind of maybe push yeast in different directions in order to deliver flavors, even if it may not be that same kind of traditional yeast that might be used in those beers.
So we have, at this point in time, we've kind of without putting a stamp on it, we've kind of dedicated ourselves to certain strains. We've got a lager strain that we really like. We've got an American strain that we really like. We've got a pair of English strains as well, and etc. And you really are completely accurate when you talk about commercially things get a little screwball with yeast. Yeast is very expensive, and it's for better or for worse.
Oh, I mean, you can look at GABF awards and see breweries that won medals in certain categories that are brewing that with a completely different yeast that no one would ever suspect that unless they told people that they were brewing that with. It's a very commonplace thing, but using those brew house magic, and some of your tools, you can get yeast to perform in specific ways that does different things than it may be known for.
And that's that's a whole part of the alchemy of beer making that is still pretty unknown to me. We do the whole stress thing on wheat beer. We've got a few beers that we know they operate better underpitched or overpitched, or a little more oxygen, a little less oxygen. But the simple fact that you're making far more yeast in a batch of beer than you purchased, it's the only kind of renewable resource in the brewery that's making you money. And so a lot of times the convenience factor on the financial end of things to ride that yeast for all it's worth is a real thing. And I've been to a lot of places where again, you get into this whole idea of samey, and I get it. Yeast is expensive, but it's important, just as it is to find that brown malt that you really like for brown beer. It's important to find that yeast that you think works sympathetically with what you're trying to do. And there are definitely times where I wonder if, such and such beer would be better with, hey, they've got, 10 other lager strains that, I'd like to try. But at what point commercially can you start committing to these things where it's like, well, now we don't have a lab. We do some simple things here, like, counting yeast, and we have a protocol of sending product for testing and analysis in another lab that's not here. But we're not growing yeast up, which we've talked about, and that would definitely open some avenues in terms of flexing out our yeast portfolio in the same way that we have the same ability to do with our malt. We've talked about it.
Yeah.
But a yeast plant takes up room and resources as well. But I am pretty glad that we, as a tap room, can ordinarily offer 3 to 4 yeast strains at any given time on the board. It's really it's so much better on the side of the person drinking to have not only the spectrum go from lower ABV to higher ABV, from pale yellow to black, but also have some of these flavor compounds and mouthfeels that you can only get through yeast. So from a pub perspective, I think it's dramatically important.
Talk to me a little bit about yeast and malt interaction.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the ways that the yeast that you use may interact differently with some of the malts. Well, how you think about malt in a way that can produce some flavors that yeast can have fun with.
So, I hope I come back to that. We recently installed a filter, and previous to that, everything had just been run from tank to tank into a keg and into a glass. And we had some beer that I didn't really think suffered for it, and then we had some other beer that I always kind of was like, that should be cleaner. But the time frame wasn't allowing it, and we got a filter, and I was, and still am, super impressed with it. I didn't realize I was going to be one of these guys, given the fact that I do like myself some pretty rustic stuff, and the idea of spinning yeast out or filtering it out, there's the whole line of thought that you're taking something out of the beer and that should have been there, or you're stripping flavor, or all these things. And I really think it's really the opposite. I think that beer that hasn't been filtered, as a general rule, not as a this isn't coming down from the heavens or anything. As a general rule, beer that has not been filtered, you as much as you're leaving the flavor in, you're masking other flavors, and those other flavors don't have a chance to come out. Case in point, I think the American Brown is definitely a better beer after filtration. The yeast on it, I think, was kind of rounding some points out in the beer that I think are just a little more happening now. I think just on a purely superficial level, a few of our beers they look better, and I've never been too down on beer that was a little too hazy or whatnot, but I've definitely been served some beer where I'm like, no, that could have used at least some period of time.
Sure.
And so I think the benefits that we've seen through filtration in terms of taking some flavors that have been in the beer, but getting them to come out more has helped. Again, smaller ABV beer, more flavor. That's a good thing, right? So I've been a really big fan of that. I kind of forgot what you originally asked.
Talking about yeast interacting with the malt.
So I don't know exactly how to answer that, except to say that we've been able to brew the same exact malt bill with different yeasts a few times, and all I can say is everything you ever read about it is totally right. Like there are massive, and it's not just the two flavors are like just different. Like we had so our beer, our British bitter, is the same beer as a beer we call Proper Pint, but they're done with the two different English strains that we use. And in one, you get really familiar with the clean quality of the malt, but then the hot of the yeast throws kind of this real juicy kind of Fruit Loops kind of aromatic that we struggle to get that same thing in a couple of the other beers that we brew with that same yeast. But I think it's the alignment of it in that particular malt bill just helps it along. Whereas when we brew it the other way, it's a much rounder and a much this is a terrible word to use to describe it, but kind of a flabbier kind of dimension to it. You know, like it just it's not as lean. It just feels like a heavier beer, even though it's not. You know, and we don't get a lot of those chances to kind of play what if. And I'd like to do that a little bit more, especially if we're able to increase pub service with more space and more taps. Your comment earlier about, cask beer. We do some cask beer, and we do it religiously more than a lot of places. But I'd like to see the number of cask beers go up.
Sure.
And so that's pretty high on my personal list.
Yeah. Before we get out of here, what's next for Civil Life? What's on the horizon, and what's the future look like for you?
Well, I think that the answer is showing itself in the beer market. Like right now, I think that beer has been almost solely responsible for the meteoric rise of hard seltzer. It's, hard seltzer is something that beer can't be, but everyone wanted beer to be it. And it just turns out that it's a different thing. And so now that we've figured that out, now hard seltzer is like going off the roof. But I think, what that looking at that and looking at other things in the market, what we're looking at now is diving deeper into what we're already doing rather than trying to do something different, trying to do exactly what we're doing, but more. And like you mentioned, okay, check pills. Maybe we'll step up that game, bringing things to a level of a different kind of authenticity. But at the same time, I don't necessarily want us to just be the brewery that replicates what's already good out there. It's important to not parrot other people as well. So we've talked about, trying to increase cask, trying to bring out some life to some styles of beer that are even more lost, but probably deserving of at least putting them on a table. But, again, sometimes you do that stuff and it's really meaningful, and other times it's a little gimmicky. So we'll see where that heads, but I think that would be cool.
Well, I can't wait to taste what you come up with.
Me too.
Before we get out of here, G&D Chillers is the brewing industry's premier choice for glycol chilling. Download the Tavour app and get highly rated independent craft beer delivered right to your door. Country Malt Group understands the importance of excellent ingredients, and Clarion Lubricants is the expert that experts trust. Dylan, if people want to learn more about Civil Life Brewing, where do they find you all?
Well, physically, you will find us down on Holt in the city of St. Louis. The pub's open Sunday, closed Monday, then Tuesday through Saturday. On the interweb, you can find all this information and directions and all that at thecivillife.com. And I'm sure Jake has like an Instagram and stuff like that too.
I'm sure he does too. Thanks for joining me on the podcast, Dylan. Cheers to Civil Life. I'm going to enjoy another pint of some session strength beer.
Please do.
Cheers.
Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.